Welcome to Career Cafe, a podcast for all things career-related to help you thrive in the professional world. Welcome to our podcast episode, Refining Your References, where we're going to talk about writing references and how to go about that. Joining us today, we have Brandon Street and Clara Webster, and myself, the moderator. We are all experts in professional developed topics. Well, maybe not as much me. I'm here to moderate, so. Anyway, let's dive into why references matter. So why don't you start us off and tell us what references are and why they matter?
Yeah, I think references are a great way to help differentiate yourself from others, but also to validate yourself as a candidate, right? As they go through the process and the time comes to reach out to your references, I know that for me in particular, when I've looked for people to hire, references have been a great way to solidify I'm hiring the right person by what people say about them. Now, it's understood that, obviously they're going to pick the people who usually will speak good about them, but I have had instances where I've spoke to people and they didn't speak so well about the candidate, and that in itself was eye-opening. And so references can be very beneficial to candidates, but also if you're not careful and play your cards right, they can be detrimental in the process as well. So we're going to talk a little bit today about how to establish good references, but I think it does start with one thing, and that's being a great person on a job, right? And making sure that as you're on a job, you're always creating references of those around you, right? It's by your work ethic, the way you do jobs, the way you treat other people, you're creating or losing references all along the way. And so I think each day on the job, whether or not we're satisfied with our job, we should work that job in a way that we can create great references on the way out.
Yeah. And especially, if you're wanting to leave a job, if you have a good attitude, the chances of you being able to find another one will increase. So,
Yeah.
So it's always good to treat a job as basically, potential place to get more references.
So, as far as references go, we usually suggest as you're creating a reference list. So if an employer asks for references, I don't recommend that a reference list goes on a resume generally. Right. There are some resume types that does occur in. But generally, we suggest that the resume list is a separate document from your resume and your cover letter. It actually serves as a third document, usually with its own header, and then we include the reference list there. And again, as we talk about the importance of these references, these are great ways for you to show the work you've done through what people have to say about you.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Brandon. Tell us how you go about selecting your references.
Yeah, so one thing that I always say when you're looking at different references, the most important thing is find someone, just like Brandon was saying earlier, who can talk well about you. I've hired people and had to reach out to references, and that has made or it can make or break whether you're going to get hired. There was a candidate that we thought was going to be really great, and it was kind of neck and neck between two of them. But when it came down to the references, one had references that gave great, recommendations and said like, oh, I would, 100% hire this person. They're phenomenal. We just loved having them around. But then the other candidate chose people in the office that were, really high status, but they didn't know them super well. And so they were thinking, oh, like this person will give me an advantage because I would be working with them in that office. But they didn't know them and how they, are at work, so they couldn't give a very good reference, and so we ended up going with the other candidate. So that's the number one thing when selecting a reference. Make sure they can talk well about you and speak to your professional abilities and character. But typically, what we usually recommend for like who those references should be, if you're applying for a job, you want to have at least one supervisor in there for sure, someone who is kind of directly overseeing the work that you've done. And if possible, usually I recommend having like two supervisors and then maybe like a professor on campus or another staff member, someone else that you've worked with kind of in a different capacity. Because professors, you do a lot of, they see a lot of your work. You're in them or you're with them in class. And so anyway, it's good to get a mix of supervisors and either mentors or professors or other people like that. But there definitely are some type of references that you want to avoid.
Yeah, I'd suggest that you avoid friends and family, You don't want to have on your reference list mom. You know what I mean? I just don't think that's a great idea. Mom's going to say great things about you, hopefully, right? But
Hopefully.
I think she's
That would
going
be
to say,
really bad.
he doesn't clean his room much, but he's a great kid, right? But so you don't want family or friends on there because you want them to, again, you want the employer to understand, yeah, I have people in the professional world who can speak well of me.
Yeah, and then another question that we get asked a lot too is, well, what if my last job didn't end super well, right? And I don't know if I can list that person as a reference. Either, maybe we're on bad terms, or I just don't know if they could speak well about me. And so yeah, Brandon, what do you do in that situation?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, I mean, you still can list colleagues. Remember that. Hopefully you haven't burned all your bridges on the last job. I mean, if that was the case, obviously your references won't come from that job, and they may ask you questions. You've got to be ready for that. But if it's a particular individual, and let's say it's your supervisor, you can ask for reference from a colleague, and hopefully use a supervisor from another job or things like that. But just be ready you always need to be ready to answer the question of why you didn't do that, right? Just in case. So
Yeah, and even people have asked me too, like maybe they're looking for a new job right now and don't want their current supervisor to know they're looking, right? Because obviously if they ask them to be a reference, then they're gonna have to tell them, oh, I'm looking for another job, by the way. And so yeah, just like Brandon said, be sure to know, if they ask you about, why didn't you list your last reference? Be sure to provide them with the reason. That, is it just, oh, I hate that job, I need to get out of there. But, just say, oh, I have other colleagues that I thought could speak well of my qualifications as well, and didn't want my supervisor to, maybe know just quite yet that I'm in this process.
Right.
Just be honest with them.
Right, exactly.
Yeah. We've talked about selecting your references and who to decide to put on these documents. How do you go about, well, we've talked about the importance of asking references before you just put them down, right? So,
Boy, that's so important, though. I've literally received a phone call where someone's called me and said, hey, I'm calling on a reference on so-and-so, and I'm like, it had been like, first of all, they didn't ask me. Second of all, it'd been a long time since we've worked together. I forgot the person who they were.
Oh, gosh.
And so they called me and said,
no.
they said, hey, yeah, we're calling a reference on so-and-so. Can you just tell me about it? I'm like, I'm sorry, I don't know who you're talking about. And they're like, oh, so-and-so. But it had literally been years. I'm talking 5-6 years since I had worked with them. And so it wasn't until I hung up that I realized who it was. And I felt so bad.
No.
I felt so bad. But honestly, like, if that would have been avoided had the individual called me and just said, hey, heads up, I've applied for a job. So is it okay if I'm using you as a reference for that, right? I would have totally remembered who this individual was when they called, and I would have had great things to say. But I was caught so off guard that I just didn't remember who they were, and I guarantee you that did not help them.
Oh, yeah.
So ask. I mean, and not only ask is, one thing I'd suggest you do is when you do ask permission to be a reference, guide those references. I call it priming your references, right? So give them material and things that they should talk about when they talk to your potential employee or employer. Make sure that you bring up things like projects you did in class that they should remember, because they're not going to remember everything, right? But if you help spark those memories, then they'll be ready when the call comes, that they don't have to think through a bunch of things. So remind them of projects you did, how you work together, but also help them understand this is what they're looking for. So I'm hoping you'll talk about these things, because then you kind of keep it in the realm of why you're a good candidate for that job as well, right?
Yeah, and so yeah, every time I ask for a reference, I'll send them my resume, and if I'm doing a cover letter too, I'll send them all my application documents. I'll even send them the job posting, and then I'll prime them with some things like, I'm really hoping you can touch on, either this project that I did or different skills that they've seen me use. So yeah, it's really important to provide them. Well, first, it's important to make sure that they're okay with you, or with you listing them as a preference. But then, make sure you give them all the materials that they need and let them know what you're hoping they can touch on for you.
And also let them know when they should probably be reached out to. Now, I would recommend you do this early in the application process. I know a lot of times we think the reference calls happen, right after, far into the process, right? Maybe at the end of the process. But I applied for a job. I went in for an interview, and they were literally calling my references within 24 hours. I had no idea even. All of a sudden, my references started coming to me and like, hey, they're calling me right now. I'm like, what? Right. So,
Oh gosh.
so just be aware that it could happen pretty quickly. And so you don't want to interview and then ask your references when they already could be calling them. Right. And so make sure you ask them early, help them understand, hey, I'm applying for some jobs right now. You may get contacted within a few weeks. Just kind of give them a heads up along the way what may be going on.
Mhm.
Yeah, communication is huge with references. And we talk about, making sure they're aware you're including them or asking them for permission, right, first, and then making them aware that you are including them on your reference document. But let's talk about building and keeping that strong relationship and communicating with them over time. Like you had mentioned, that person had been like 5 or 6 years and you probably hadn't heard from them once, had you?
Yeah, no, I hadn't.
Yeah, I'm sure.
And so, yeah, you make a really good point. And it is important to make sure that periodically, if they're going to be your reference, keep in contact with them. Even if it's a short note here and there, how you're doing, asking how they're doing. One interesting thing, when I applied for my first job after college, I used two professors as references on and they were professors who knew me well. They could speak well of me. And what was really cool is, I kept up a relationship with them. They served as references. I got the job, which was really cool. I came back to the SU area 9 years after I got that job, and ran into one of those who were my reference, a professor. And because of the relationship we had developed and continued to develop, he knew exactly who I was still, and we had a great conversation. I thanked him for being my reference and still and getting the job that I did, and contributed to them being part of that process. So keeping those references are important, because when the time comes, you want them to know what you're doing now too, not just we worked together 10 years ago. It's a little bit hard to say and be a good reference when you're talking about 10 years ago. So.
Yeah, and I've even got a couple people, that I've used as references before, and I could easily see myself using them as references in the future. And so, I'll check it. You don't have to email them every week, but, every couple months I like to check in with one, because she travels internationally all the time. So it's more for me just to be like, hey, where you been lately? Just because she has cool stories. But it's good to check in periodically. Maybe even once or twice a year, send them a text or an email if you happen to run into them, and just check in, just so, when you do have that experience where you need to list a reference, then it's not going to be like, oh, I haven't talked to them in 10 years. I wonder if they'd still be okay with listing me, or with me listing them, and if they could even, talk well about me still. Right.
Right.
I love it. I wanted to talk about, lastly, formatting your reference document. We've talked so much about what references are and who you should include on as a reference. And so how do you format a reference document?
Yeah, great question. And like Brandon said earlier, it is going to be a separate document from your resume and cover letter. Usually, I mean, they should just be a page. You're usually listing 3 people on it. But yeah, it's going to have the same header as your resume and cover letter. So your name with your contact information. And then within that, like I said, typically they're going to ask for 3 references. Of course, provide however many the job asks for, but usually that's 3. And what you'll want to do is just list them down the page. You'll start with the reference's name. Underneath their name, you'll list their position, and then underneath that, their contact information. So for me, if you're listing me as a reference, you'd put Clara Webster. Underneath that, career advisor. You'd put Southern Utah University, since that's where I work at currently, and then my contact, my email and phone number right there. After you have kind of that section of who the person is, then you will have a brief description of your professional relationship. So if I was listing Brandon, my supervisor, as a reference, I would put Brandon Street is my direct supervisor in my career advisor position, right? I just say, basically show them, how do you know this person? In what capacity did you work with them? And what job was it? So
one other thing I'd suggest is, just as with any document that you're creating and when you're applying for a job, is make sure these are all branded together, right? Make sure they have the same font, they have the same look. When they're looking at your reference list, they shouldn't be wondering, is this from the same person as the resume, right? So make sure that the header and the font and the spacing and all those things replicate the same type of branding look that you had on the resume and the cover letter, to ensure both professionalism, right, and that first impression that you'll get.
Thanks, listeners, for tuning in to Career Cafe. We have to end with a dad joke, of course. You guys, I just quit my job working for Nike. I just couldn't do it anymore.
Aha! Just do it.
Just do it. Tune in next week.